So if you have a U.S. corporation that owns a REIT and it's less than 25% foreign owners, the proposed regs wouldn't apply to that. But even if I have lots of small owners, if in total in that U.S. corporation, if they in total 25% or more, now I have to look through that U.S. corporation and treat the pro rata share held by those foreign owners in my domestically controlled REIT test. And that's the big change in the proposed regs.
Joining me today is Adam Feuerstein, principal with PwC. Adam, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, no, thanks for having me.
Now, can you start by providing a brief overview of the existing FIRPTA rules and how they apply to domestically controlled U.S. REITs?
Sure. So there are a couple of general rules that are helpful to understand to see how FIRPTA fits in. So one general rule that applies for non-U.S. investors is that if they invest in a U.S. trade or business, they pay taxes like any other U.S. person. They file an income tax return like any other U.S. person. So if foreigners are either directly engaged in a U.S. trade or business, or if they invest in a partnership that's engaged in a U.S. trade or business, they pay taxes like any other U.S. person. A second general rule is when a foreign person sells stock of a corporation, the general rule is they pay no tax on that. So if a foreign person sells stock in Microsoft or Apple or something like that, they generally pay no gain on the sale of that tax. It's not treated as U.S. income. So those are our two general rules that I'll start with. But then FIRPTA comes into play, and FIRPTA is an exception to those rules. And it says, well, if you sell a U.S. real property interest, you pay tax on that. A non-U.S. person will pay tax on that like a foreign person, even if they aren't engaged in a U.S. trade or business. And then so if they sell land, for example, right, even if they just hold the land, they're not in a U.S. trade or business, they pay tax just like any other person. So that's one of the things that FIRPTA does. The second thing that FIRPTA does is that it defines a U.S. real property interest as including stock of a corporation that holds at least 50% U.S. real property interests. And so if a foreign person, let's say, holds stock in a REIT, and that REIT holds a lot of U.S. real property, even though the general rule is sale of a stock is not subject to tax, FIRPTA says the sale of that stock that predominantly holds U.S. real estate is subject to tax. And that brings us to domestically controlled REITs, because no tax code section would be worth its salt if it didn't have an exception to the exception. And so the exception to the exception here, or at least one of them, is domestically controlled REITs. And so if a non-U.S. person sells stock of a domestically controlled REIT, that takes you back to the general rule. And now that foreign person will not pay any tax on the sale of domestically controlled REIT stock.
Great. Now, my understanding is there are proposed regulations that would change the rules for domestically controlled REITs. Can you explain on a high level what impact that would have?
Sure, and let me unpack what a domestically controlled REIT is first to then show how the regs do that. So a domestically controlled REIT is effectively a REIT, less than 50% of the interests of which are held by foreign persons. And so the flip side of that is more than 50% is held by U.S. persons. And so that raises a question, which is, let's say I have a REIT, and it has a stockholder that's a U.S. corporation, so it would be domestic, but that U.S. corporation has non-U.S. holders up above it, so a second level up. Under the rules, do I treat the REIT as being held in part by foreign persons because of these foreign persons that are further up the chain above the U.S. corporation? And for a variety of reasons, people got very comfortable that the right answer was you don't look through that U.S. corporation, looking both at how the statute is drafted, the fact that it doesn't have attribution rules, the fact that the IRS issued a private letter ruling coming to that conclusion, the fact that Congress, in enacting some rules under the PATH Act, effectively did not apply a look-through rule for corporations, while it did apply look-through rules for private REITs. And so all of this led people to get very comfortable that the right answer was that you don't look through a U.S. corporation. And the regulations just flip that on its head, the proposed regulations. And they effectively say that you do look through a U.S. corporation if the U.S. corporation has at least 25% foreign owners. So if you have a U.S. corporation that owns a REIT and it's less than 25% foreign owners, the proposed regs wouldn't apply to that. But even if I have lots of small owners, if in total in that U.S. corporation, if they in total 25% or more, now I have to look through that U.S. corporation and treat the pro rata share held by those foreign owners in my domestically controlled REIT test. And so that's the big change in the proposed regs.
And what has been the overall reaction to those proposals within the industry?
Yeah, I'd say the reaction has been relatively negative. And I think the main reason is because people have looked at all of this authority and have been relying on it for years and think that that's really the controlling law in the area. So I think people were surprised by it from that perspective and didn't think it was the right answer. But that being said, people also have to react to it, and it's there, right? And so people have to figure out how do they approach it, and that depends a lot on people's circumstances. Some people, this is a priority issue. It's really important that their investors expect them to be compliant, or they're raising capital today. They have to react in a more urgent way, for example, than other people where it may be an issue, but it's not as important, not as, they can wait and see to see what happens. So different reactions based on the way where people are in the market.
And lastly, to what extent are investors relying on the suggested transition rules, and what impact is that having on the market?
Yeah, so the transition rules, again, we don't exactly know what they are. Things that have been proposed are, for example, that there'll be a period of time after the final regulations where people can restructure under the rules that they thought had been the rules before, that stock of domestically controlled, or of REITs that existed as of the proposed regulations would be grandfathered, and those wouldn't be subject to the new proposed regs. Some people are proposing that the stock be grandfathered and not be subject to the rules if they existed at the time of the proposed regs. I don't know that many people can rely on them because you don't know what they are until they're there. And so it would be helpful if they have those rules, but from a practical perspective, anyone who it's really important to can't really rely on the fact that they're going to be there unless the IRS or Treasury, which isn't their norm, telegraph that they're going to be there and tell people what's there. Because otherwise, people who it's important to can just wake up one day, the rules are finalized, and maybe there are no transition rules. And so they at least have to be able to accept that as a possibility. And if it's an acceptable possibility, they can wait. But if it's not, if they're like, no, the rules as proposed, if those are finalized, that would be a bad answer, then those people really have to act up front.